Welcome to another episode of Learning for Truth and Love. I have finally mustered the courage to do what I've wanted to do for years, and in some ways have been leading up to in my work, which is really talking about our mental health, especially it relates to learning. Understanding mental health has been important for me for many, many reasons, and I will, share some of the things that I've had to learn and the ways I've had to get to know myself to be successful. Getting to know myself has been really instrumental to my own journey and my own journey in my career in general and my own success. And it's also one of the reasons, well, I shouldn't say it's just one of the reasons, but it's given me some really unique insights when it comes to understanding my own work on Black representations in the science curricula, which is why when I wrote this book, I felt a need to have an entire part one devoted to understandings I gained about how we think as learners, how we think as people, and how that intertwines and connects with societal thinking. And a lot of this led me to, well, it led me from looking at schema theory. I think it's one of the things I've been drawn to, and one of the reasons I've been drawn to, even though a lot of the way it's been implemented is not without controversy. It is with controversy. But a lot of it also has to do with some of the lack of rigor. And so when I was trying to figure out how to bring this book all together, especially, bring all my work and frame it, I went back, of course, to my dissertation work on schema theory and one of my own popular quote on social schemas. But I didn't find anything except for that one quote that you'll find in all my papers that talks about where a researcher, Sakamoto and Love, talk about social schemas as being used as filtering devices. But I didn't find any particular study that really lent itself to what it was I wanted to show some of the patterns that I saw in my work. So what I did was to use what I understood about what a social schema was, and apply that to the recurring patterns that I saw. And it's also one of the reasons I gave a talk on getting to know yourself and understanding each other, especially related to issues that are going on in our society today. So I want to start by, well, first of all, just to forecast some of the things to come. Next week and the week after, we're going to have two live podcast sessions. And I invited a special guest, someone who's an expert in mental health and trauma. And so you can join live to discuss. But I wanted to use today to just lay some of I don't want to say groundwork because it's not necessarily, the main focus of my research, but I wanted to just to get you started thinking about how I thought about this and why. I used a definition in my book that was different from what I searched up today. I just did a little search and I wanted to start by defining what is mental health. It says mental health, according to the World Health Organization. It's a different definition I Googled and found. It's a state of mental well being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. And I had to share that because to help people to understand mental health is really integral to so many of the things going on today. And I really do believe to solve and to address in healthy ways what's going on, we have to also include not just the economic pipeline, but also mental health, which is how I ended my book. That's the last short chapter on the implications for all of this, both the economic pipeline and mental health. And especially if you look at the words themselves, and I don't even have to say much, let's talk about people coping with the stresses, realizing their ability. Integral to learning, integral to understanding. And I do have to say, getting to know myself was important, especially being an educator, because I felt I couldn't relate a lot to much of the struggles that, sometimes came up with our students. And I realize now it's not because I wasn't having those struggles myself. But part of it was one, not being as in touch with some of those struggles. And I think what puts me in a very unique position is I used schoolwork as my escape. I used the very thing um that we want students to be successful, but schoolwork, burying my head in a book, was my own was the way I coped, was my coping mechanism. Working was my coping mechanism. And so this started since I was very young. Since I was a kid, really. I would, and I don't think I really talked about this much, but I would literally, without exaggeration, I can study for 8 hours straight as a kid. I would sit there reading a book, textbook, as a matter of fact, I did. I took a textbook because I wanted to learn physics, and the particular school I was at they weren't offering it. And I just read the whole textbook for the whole year and did some of the experiments on my own. And schoolwork was my escape until I got to college. I did well my first year. Did really well my first year and the Indeed list and all of that when I was at Barnard, Columbia. But then when I started to get in touch and trying to balance things and building friendships and looking at life itself, so many things started to come apart. And I didn't really understand why, because I just lost motivation, the motivation to work, the motivation to do schoolwork all of a sudden. And I had to work really hard to get that desire in a different way, not as an escape. But so, it's interesting. I think that most people would not, because they see me excel. And I've always grown up in my family and people saying, oh, yeah, we know you're going to be great. And my cousins would say things like, yeah, we looked at you and we just saw the wheels turning in your head. And I don't remember what those conversations were like, but I think it's safe to say that, yes, the wheels have always been turning. The wheels are still turning. And there are times I do want to stop the wheels from turning, but I've learned to use those wheels turning in a good way to accomplish new things, and to bring innovative ideas. I'm looking at NIH, National Institutes of Health, Mental Health. Their definition of mental health says mental health includes emotional, psychological, and social well being. It is more than the absence of mental illness, it's essential to your overall health and quality of life. And I'm quoting here, by the way, from NIH website. Self-care, and I'm reading here, can play a role in maintaining your mental health and help support your treatment and recovery if you have mental illness. I think that essential to our mental health is first addressing it. I think that so many of us are ashamed to realize or even to think that something is wrong or even to consider possibilities, but our mental health is important. And we don't know how much of what's going on is driven by the nature of our mental health. Because one decision making leads to another decision making. I think the perfect example of this is, let me just tell you how different ways in which, where our mental health is affects us. I remember years ago, I was talking to a friend about something. A lot of my friends, because I have a boy, we have boys. I have friends who've had girls, but as the years go, the people you'll become closest to as a mother are people with boys, because, you have play dates and things like that. And yeah, my son did have play dates with girls as well. So, but we end up talking about similarities. And I remember, as we were talking, giving some advice and realizing how the advice was implemented differently. And I said, oh my gosh, yeah, I can't give those type of advice, because depending on who we are, we implement advice differently. And one advice for someone may not be good for someone else because of where we are in our own predispositions. For some of us, if our predispositions are, let's just say what I learned is, if our predisposition is to be controlling, then we implement advice differently. I remember being given advice I remember the advice I was given, even when for classroom things and classroom management, and it related to controlling behaviors in certain ways. And I thought, I don't think so. prefer to work on engaging, and it's something I do in my classes. I focus on teaching students how to engage. And let's see if just focusing engagement makes a difference. And it does. And I really do believe that if we focus on engagement, which is something I talk about in my classes a lot, then we don't have to focus on controlling. I also learned that depending on our predispositions to want to control others, whatever our positions are, it will determine how we lead, how we teach, and our predisposition for being controlling will determine whether or not our goal is to provide others with agency. And I say this because, early in my life, I've had to learn early. One of the biggest things that I've learned in my journey has to do with, wow, this is so hard to talk about. And I'm talking about because I really think it's important. I really think that it will be helpful to others to know that there are other people going through these things. But I think the most challenging things I've ever had to do related to, okay, so why did I bury my head in my books? Wow, this is harder to talk about than I thought. So I buried my head in my books because, and as a child, I didn't realize that this is what I was dealing with at a time. I didn't realize, because you don't really, something is different about your mom. And I'm talking about this because I know my mom wants me to talk about it, which I was really surprised because I brought it up and she keeps saying, yeah, why don't you? Why don't you? And I keep thinking, well, the things that you've been through are things that, I've worked so hard to hide and been ashamed of instead of really being open about her challenges. But let's just say, and I will open a little at a time as helpful as I think it is to people. But let's just say that it was so bad that and I still grew up sheltered, which is then interesting. I always grew up believing that I was loved. And I was. Maybe, I was loved. My mom was very protective, very overprotective. And I told myself over and over again. But a lot of it was smothering in many ways. And I grew up so smothered and very sheltered. And I'm going to tell you this. It's nothing, not because anything particularly, but let's just say I didn't even realize. Well, I knew it was bad. But I didn't realize the extent to which even my family thought it was bad until my family was so excited that I was getting married. They thought that I would end up like my mom and I wouldn't get married and I wouldn't have a normal life, quote unquote. Some of them flew in from different places, different countries to be there at my wedding, which I was really happy that they did. But then they were open, and as I opened, they opened. They're like, they told me, wow, we just, they were so relieved. They were so relieved to learn that I was a normal person. But a lot of my coping mechanism and my escape came from that was how I coped with knowing that my mom was different and that my mom had her struggles. So early on in life, I've had to learn to set boundaries. And it's interesting because I've had to learn to set boundaries even before I knew what boundaries were. And so at one point, when someone asked me, I think they asked me to read the book Boundaries. I don't remember reading it, but I don't remember reading it at all. But I just remember knowing and setting boundaries for my mom, knowing that people with certain mental illnesses needed boundaries, setting boundaries. And then I started again reading the book, and I don't know if again, like I said, I don't know if I don't think I read the book because I don't own it, but I recently bought it. And I started looking, I was like, wow, it was affirming everything I did. So all my life, boundaries have been important to me, and I'm not sure why, but it's helped me to be successful in my life because I've had to learn to set boundaries, not first in my personal life, and it's been so amazingly helpful in my career. Yes, in my career. It's been amazingly helpful. I think because I've needed to understand mental illness, it has helped me to understand other people. The good and bad thing is, it was easy for me to spot certain things in other people. And so I started looking and realizing, behaviors I observed in others. I observed a narcissism, and I would talk to my friends. And then realize, yeah, they were going through. So mental illness is something I started talking to friends about because, my close friends, we talk. and then realize, wow, they had relationships where things were similar, where they were dealing with narcissism or other things. Can't believe I'm talking about this, but and no, that's not, my mom's main problem, but that's problems I've had in other relationships, and it helped me to be successful at work because in every area, in places, I was able to spot behaviors and almost predict. Not almost. I was able to not. I can't say was able to predict exactly what the person was going to do, but because I understood the way people think and cause and effect, and because I had to set boundaries and understand when I was being manipulated at a younger age, it helped me to recognize, and I was able to sometimes predict the way other people were going to react. I was able to predict that, for example, if someone just had an end goal in mind and that was going to focus on that end goal no matter what, I was able to predict whether someone did not have my best interest in mind. Whereas other people sometimes learned that the hard way. I kind of sort of did, but with other things. I had some positive things from my mom. I want to say her tenacity. Her tenacity. So she was always very determined. I got her perseverance from her. Despite all her struggles, that's one of her good qualities. But it can work against her too. Tenacity. Looking at definition. I love looking at definitions. I'm sorry. I think because it's tenacity. Reading here from the Oxford Languages in the Google search, the quality of fact of being able to grip something firmly. That could be good or bad, right? The quality of fact of being very determined, quality of fact of continuing to exist, persistence. So that's some of the good things. But I've had to choose what I'm going to be tenacious in and what I'm going to persist in. And it's part of setting boundaries. That's something that's been coming up a lot with me. I've been observing that in friendships, setting boundaries for myself, setting boundaries, having healthy friendships is not only about setting boundaries with others, but it's also with setting boundaries with ourselves. I see that in relationships and other people's relationships too. I realize that no matter what most people are going through, whether or not it turns out well for everyone depends on their ability to set boundaries. And when I think about boundaries, we could look at this in many other ways. I'm not talking about being controlling. I'm talking about boundaries that benefits everyone in the end, and that will lead to you being closer in the end, maybe, if the boundaries are healthy. And I guess that's the key. There are people set boundaries, but if it's not beneficial to both, or lead to the best outcome for both, or lead to it's the best mental health for both, then maybe it's not boundaries. But now, it's not the same as being happy. It doesn't mean everybody will be happy with the decisions made in setting boundaries. I really do believe that much of what's going on today comes from a lack of ability to set boundaries for oneself. And let me explain what I mean. When I think about greed, let's talk about greed. Greed comes from an inability to set boundaries. Let's look up what greed means. Intense and selfish desire for something, especially wealth, power, or food. Greediness. So where do boundaries come in here, right? Greediness. Let's see, what does greediness mean? Okay. Needing more. You don't know when to say stop. Okay? You have an excessive amount. You don't know what to say stop. You keep hoarding it. You don't share it. It comes from a lack of ability to set boundaries, a lack of self-control, and a lack of good qualities. We often don't associate those things with mental health and mental illness. But there's a direct connection. There's a direct connection between our well-being. I really do believe all our well-being in society is connected. Let me say this. I've had moments that have served as huge turning points for me. One of them, I never forget years ago. Years ago, one of my therapists asked me to write down the things I was ashamed of. Boy. And, and I really, I have to say, of all the therapists I've seen over the years. She's the first one, the Black woman, who asked me to do that. And what I remember was this: it was so difficult that I had to stop seeing her. I stopped seeing her for several reasons because I was just so busy and too busy to attend to things. Every time I tried to write things down, I just was really painful to do so. But a couple, maybe a year later, I hit a really hard challenge, and the only thing that helped me to get through was dealing with my shame experiences. And that's when I discovered Brene Brown's work. I discovered her book, The Power of Vulnerability. And I listened to that book, the entire book, and it helped me get through. As a matter of fact, it brought me to the next level. I didn't have to be ashamed anymore. And I can talk to whoever, my therapist, about what I was ashamed of and why. So, because sometimes the things we don't realize, the things we're ashamed of are not things oftentimes we should be ashamed of. They're things that often are societal imposed. And so in my book, one of the social schemas that I talk about in part 1, I do relate. I found her research paper, and some other psychologist work, and related to what I believe is one of the prominent social schemas is our society that controls us, that drives us, that determines where we go, when we go, that manipulates us in so many ways. I don't think all shame is bad, but a lot of it is, especially that relating to an unhealthy society is for sure. We use it in unhealthy ways, but there are healthy ways. So that's one of the biggest turning points. I mean, I just felt, as a matter of fact, once when I dealt with that, that was a moment I thought, yep, I'm ready to do a TEDx. I felt like nothing could stop me from doing that. And I just went and did a TEDx on shame. And the next big turning point for me, I would say was it over a year ago? Biggest turning point for me was over a year ago, and things I was really struggling to figure out what the next steps were. What was it I wanted to do and focus on? And how can I get rid of some of the blocks and the roadblocks I felt like that were in my way? And so what I did, I stumbled upon Dr. Thema Bryant's book on homecoming. Okay, so Dr. Thema Bryant's book is called Homecoming, Healing Trauma to Reclaim Your Authentic Self. And I was ready, after I was done with that book, I was ready to go to the next level in my life. One of the things that really stood out to me from what she said was, if you were never recognized, can you recognize yourself? And would recognizing yourself be enough? And I thought, wow, oh, why didn't I ever think of that? I could recognize myself. Of course I can. And of course, that can be enough. And then I was ready to move on to the next chapter in my life. So I share this to say that there are powerful ways. And let me just say my biggest motivation for this. I recently had a conversation with another peer, and we were talking about, mental health, because, that's something he tries to, he writes about. And one of the things I shared was one of the driver for me, and not just one, something I think about and I cry about, is when I hear about, children committing, hurting themselves. And I just find it so painful to think about. It just hurts to hear and read about. And, I've always hoped that in some way I can reach these children so they can know how amazing and how important they are. It's really, really unfortunate when a child gets to the point when they don't want to, they want to hurt themselves and harm themselves. And so, that's my goal. That's my hope. I finally had the courage to start reaching out to schools, and hopefully, I can, with my fiction books and my writing, just start to talk about these topics in real ways, and most importantly, talk about solutions. And I look forward to having those conversations. Wow. Thank you for listening to probably the most difficult episode I've ever recorded. And I look forward to the next 2 weeks. Well, next week on the 14th and the 21st, we'll have some live sessions with an expert in mental health and trauma. Yeah, and those will be posted most likely the following week after. So those will be Monday. So you can check it out on my YouTube channel at Catherine Quinlan, or you can wait the following week for it to be aired in a podcast, Learning for Truth and Love. Thank you for listening. And if you like these episodes, please like it and please subscribe so you can get the next one. Thank you.